Thank you all for being here today, and thank you, of course, to Leslie and James. We're here today to talk about what is driving American politics today, the extremists or the moderates. And before we get to this big question, I think there are a lot of little questions that we're going to be answering, right? Who's making the biggest media splashes? Who's running each party? Who's actually influencing policy? And in some ways, these questions may have very different answers. Before we go there, you both know that AJC is fiercely bipartisan. And it's not a legal footnote for us. It's a fundamental tenet of how we do our advocacy. We are driving towards the center because that's where we know change happens, that without compromise consensus, you can't move forward. And we believe that bipartisanship, nonpartisanship, is how we maintain our democracy. So it's with sort of an enthusiastic voyeurism that I now ask you to name some names, because politics is dynamic and definitions are fluid. So I think we need to know, who do we mean when we say the extremists, and who do we mean when we say moderates? So Leslie, I'd like to start with you, and if you could maybe
talk about the Democrats.
Talk about the Democrats. Yes. Tell us, okay, in the Democratic Party, who are the extremists and who are the moderates?
We talk about the squad, the AOC. We've talked about, which is very familiar with this group, and I lead with AOC because you had a group of young progressive women who came into Congress, elected, and on the winds of that, really came in not looking for compromise, but looking for ways to change a system they feel is fundamentally broken. And I was facetiously saying, let me lead with the Democrats, but I wanted to lead with the big name on the right, the big names on the right. We all still are talking about former President Donald Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene. We're continuing to talk about DeSantis in Florida, and increasingly Texas governors, Greg Abbott. What's interesting about the voices on the right, and I know we'll get to the congressional side, is increasingly they are the governors. Republicans hold a significant number of state houses through the last election, which allowed them to have a lot of redistricting, to redraw the lines, to get a lot more Republican favorable seats. And a lot of that is so that they can get it checked off by the governors because they spend a tremendous amount of time lining up governors to support those efforts. So this idea of who the names are, I think you're going to start to see these governors and hearing these names jockeying as we move toward 2024.
Who are the moderates? This is harder?
It's harder because, let's say, who are the moderates? People would say Liz Cheney is part of that iconic establishment Republican, going back to her father's age and reconciliation. If you even think about her father, though, and I'm sure James has got a lot to say about her father, he was not considered somebody who was centrist and a good representative of the Republican Party for a lot of different reasons. Interestingly, I'm laughing. The establishment Republicans, who we traditionally feel are the ones who come to the table, Mitch McConnell or any of our Kevin McCarthy that we talk about in leadership, people are very critical now of Kevin McCarthy as someone who can't navigate either side. If he moves toward compromise, he's seen as somebody who is not listening to his populist, very tilted conservative movement. If he's trying to work in any way with Pelosi, then he's seen as establishment and people are trying to run a primary against him. So basically, the claws are out for individuals who are trying to bridge that. But I do think as we move in the conversation, there's some really good positives coming from that.
Thank you, James. You can also rebut.
Thank you for very insightful. Well, I'm glad to be back here. I was here some years ago, and of course I worked in Israel in the late 90s and came back, and Ehud Barak's campaign, and Larry King asked me on television, said, what advice did you give Barak in the last 3 days of the campaign? I said, well, I think we need to concentrate on that all-important Jewish vote. But thank you all. So the setup is this. Here comes some of my Republican friends and say, James, look, we got our crazies. I'll concede that. But you got to admit that you got crazies too. I mean, we both got crazies, right? Let's dive just slightly deeper into that. So let's assume you have a niece, nephew, comes in and says, guess what? I just got a job as a research assistant in AOC's office. Your reaction would probably be similar to mine. Well, you're going to meet some interesting people, be a good experience. You're going to see some things that, you know, that your uncle would disagree with, but it's a good opportunity for you. If, on the other hand, your niece or your nephew comes and says, I got a job in Marjorie Taylor Greene's office or Carl Palladino's office, you go to the Empire State Building and jump. Your life is over. All right? One is a kind of silly, ungrounded phase that people go through. The other is just rank evil. And you got to understand the difference. The extreme, and people come to me and say, well, James, how does it feel to be a moderate Democrat? I said, I have no idea. I've never been a moderate Democrat. I've always been a liberal Democrat. But I'm not nuts. There's a difference. All right? And we can go on, but there's something that I was just, Jill and I were talking this morning. There's a piece, and you have to read this, and it's a publication called The Intercept. Just so you know, The Intercept is a kind of one of the most influential publications on the American left. And when you finish reading it, and it's long, your head will explode. Because all they do is fight with each other. Have you ever seen, like, the squad run against a Republican? No. It's Joe Crowley and Elliot Engel or everything that's wrong with America. It's not really Mitch McConnell or Newt Gingrich. And I just think there are misguided priorities. And I'll conclude with this. Anybody that tries to convince you that you can bring about social change and fundamental change in America without political power is out of their minds. Just understand that. To achieve anything, any major goal that you want or you think is important, in this country, you achieve it mostly through political power. You're going to just see how much is going to be achieved through political power when this month's Supreme Court decisions come down. It will be a good lesson in who runs this country.
Before we move on, you have any rebuttals? Anything you want to say about
I don't know if I would have started
Marjorie
with
Taylor Greene?
evil. I would have gone with evil. The interesting part about that, and a lot of it, I agree with James. I'm going to be a contrarian on a few other things, but I do agree with him on how extreme it is. But what the part people don't talk about is how repeatedly there are large groups of voters that support these candidates, and they keep winning over and over again. And people say, oh, we're going to target them, and oh, they're the extreme. But increasingly that extreme, you know, at first it was like one person or two people could fit in a phone booth, and I date myself by talking about what a phone booth is. People remember what that, they moved the last one away. I was like, goodbye. But, you know, but I could fit in a phone booth. And now, like this, the gaggle is slightly larger in terms of the number of people that are getting persuaded by a select few voices. But to James' point, the impact that they're having legislatively is still incredibly small. If anything, it's a distraction more than actually implementing true policy.
Okay, let's hold that, because I think we need to start with how we got to this moment. And because you both have spent so much time on TV, in our living rooms, on the screen, I want to know how much you think the media can be the fall guy for this. You know, how much can we blame the 24-hour news cycle, the need for viewership, the need for constant excitement and entertainment about current events for a slide towards extremism? James.
Well, I keep hearing this, the media that, and particularly, you know, living in South Louisiana. I said, I don't know how to tell you this, but the media has nowhere near the power it used to have. Let me give you an example. When Walter Cronkite came out against Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson said, I've lost Walter Cronkite. I've lost the war. Well, if you lose Wolf Blitzer, you ain't lost shit. Who cares? And I like Wolf, all right? Then somebody said, well, there's an editorial in the New York Times. Oh, God. When's the last time you read one of those? All right. As the country has become the whole media landscape, even in '92, we'd have 50 reporters on the campaign plane. Now, you might have 10. I mean, the power of the media is not near as much as people perceive it to be. Not at all. And the tragic thing is, like the Times, the Journal, the Washington Post have become even more, they've become larger. The media out in the rest of the country is just shrinking to no end. So there's no one to cover the St. Louis Airport Authority or the Kansas City School Board or any of this stuff. It's just shrunk, its presence has just shrunk back to, I think, a really, really dangerous level. I think the country would be better off, actually, if the media was a little more powerful. I know that's kind of counterintuitive, and it's something that you're not supposed to say, but if we had some national markers, as we did, no one can name the 3 news anchors on the networks anymore. It's not a reflection on anything. It's just a reflection on the society and the culture that we live in. It's just different than the one that we grew up in, particularly for people of an advanced age, as I am.
Even if you think about late night, and it reminds me of Bill Clinton and the saxophone, and like though there were moments where the culture of the country could be shifted by late night talk. You know, if you appeared, then it would either humanize a candidate or show them to be somebody you'd want to drink a beer with, or kind of any of those values that people think about through a lens of leadership. Is this somebody who can be an executive authority? Is this somebody who can command our troops and should be given that authority? And there are different lenses by which we saw them, and culturally, we used to check those boxes: late night television interviews, the one-on-ones with the anchors, Sunday talk around the political roundtable, the White House press room, or the bully pulpit, we'd say the power of that at the White House. It has so fundamentally shifted. But I did want to kind of start inserting, where did a lot of this come from? A lot of this, and it goes through waves. We're in a transformational moment right now in our country. And I particularly talk about the economic crash of 2008 and the impact it had, because what it did was it broke people's faith fundamentally in public and private institutions, because the impact of that hurt so many families at different socioeconomic levels. And for years, taking surveys after that, people lost faith, they lost their 401ks, they had to tap into them, they had to restore their financial security for their family, the plans that they had for their education for their children. Like, everything changed, and it wasn't just people at the bottom of the level, it was people that thought they had saved and done everything right. The pensions were destroyed for many companies. There no longer are pensions. So as people and families through that generation were recovering, they really started feeling that they had to depend solely on themselves, that they didn't trust the banks anymore. They didn't trust the government to do what they were supposed to do. They didn't trust the schools in the way that they started to. And that polarization, just on fundamentally how they felt it in their family, is what started to shift. And you saw the rise of populist movements. In the Republican side, it was the Tea Party movement that had the genesis of that was even earlier in the 90s, but you started seeing these candidates that the establishment could kind of squash down, but they were running against them in the primaries, but they started to get a lot more successful in the types of candidates they were running, the types of campaigns they were running, and people's frustration with what they call weak or wimpy traditional Republicans, establishment Republicans who weren't getting anything done.
And one of the things that I think was happening also at that time, because it coincided with the rise of social media, is that instead of going to traditional media sources that were more established, more mainstream, people could have curated news, right? They could seek out and be reinforced by their own viewpoints over and over again. And Leslie, I'm going to stay with you because this is a part of what you do on the day-to-day, right? You are a consultant. You advise people in their digital content. When you're advising a candidate, is it in their best interest to be crazy on social media to get attention?
Please be crazy. That'll make our job so much easier.
Please.
But, well, some of them are trying to get through the fray, right? I don't necessarily, we went from a 24-hour news cycle to the 2 to 4 second tweet cycle. Strange thing about this, James and I were talking about this over 10 years ago, and just how fast everything moved around. You think of Barack Obama's campaign, and the last month of the campaign, even the last weeks of the campaign, they were using YouTube for the first time and creating ads targeting very specific individuals based by every hour. There was a new ad coming up. Now you had kind of the big situation with Cambridge Analytica in the last election cycle, where people were really micro-targeting based on your behaviors, your patterns, your personal data, in ways that now the layer and the frightening layer on top of that is AI that's going to fundamentally work even faster at targeting and micro-targeting. So there's a technology aspect in terms of how strategists and some of these entities are looking at delivering exactly the message that's going to push attitude, intention, and behavior and push you right over the cliff one way or the other. That is the frightening part of this. When it comes to candidates, candidates are trying to do the same thing they've been trying to do forever, is get some attention when they don't have any money and be boisterous and powerful. And some of it does not sound logical a lot of times, and we try to rein it in. But they are tapping, I'd say, Texas is a good example of that. They are tapping into a lot of frustration. So just think of it like Avatar, you know, when you plug into the big tree, like it's they're tapping into this ongoing frustration that we call the populist movement that is in the country right now. It tends to lean more conservative, and they want action, and those are the candidates who are being rewarded.
James, Leslie's been talking a lot about populism.
About what?
Populism.
Right.
What's happening on the left?
Well, let's expand this. There's a big debate in the Democratic Party. And that there are people that believe that writing dictionaries and language and certain, quote, progressive, unquote, agenda should be at the forefront. And then there's a group which I decidedly consider myself in, and they're actually called populist. And it was best articulated by a young Democratic strategist named David Shore. And it basically says that we should take popular issues and present those to the public and run on them, which I've always thought was a pretty good idea, as opposed to taking unpopular issues to the public and running on them. And populism is a little bit different. You know, it started as in more of an agrarian movement, and it was anti-bank, and it didn't like the gold standard. It wanted free credit. The populism now has become very cultural. I mean, culture is taking it over. It's much more cultural than it is economic. They'll pay homage to, they don't like corporate America, but it's more that coastal people are foisting their culture on us, and we resist the culture that they do. And so if you live, when you talk about social media, you talk about TikTok or whatever it is, that's 21% of the country. That's mostly educated, white, coastal people. And most people feel not engaged. And so the big thing, the Democrat strategy is, in order to get young people, we got to do something about student loan forgiveness. All right? Take the number of people from 18 to 34 that own student loans, and take the people 18 to 34 that are hourly workers or earn a minimum wage. You know which one is bigger? Hourly workers earning a minimum wage. They passed a child tax credit when Biden first came into office. It reduced child poverty by 40%. Yes, it reduced child poverty. That the idea that we should all be offended that a child in this country could possibly go to bed cold or hungry is offensive to everyone. That expired. A prominent Democratic congressman said he got 100 calls about student loans and never got a single call about the child tax care credit. And the danger of being a coastal educated party is that you've never been there, or you forget about who really votes and lives in this country. And it's very important that political strategists, particularly politicians, policymakers, journalists, understand that. If all you do is talk to people like you and that think like you, you're just going to continue. There's no chance that you can grow or understand anything more. And that is, in my view, a large part of the problem that Democrats or the center left or people like, I have most of the policy goals that the more progressive part of the party has. Some I disagree with. For the most part, I kind of want the same thing. I want to have an active federal government that dulls the harsher edges of capitalism, that has support for education, has income support, has retirement security, does something about the huge issue of climate, of which living in South Louisiana is going to destroy us, does something about all of the other issues that we have, but we have to go about it in a way that brings people in, not puts people off. As simple as that sounds, it's a real problem on the American left.
I was going to say, that sounds like a very good conservative Democrat platform. Like a lot of
Yeah, I'm not. Again, there's nothing. I'm not a conservative. I'm actually a liberal. Okay, but I believe that if you want to talk to someone and convince them, you speak to them in their language. If I went in New Orleans and they had 3 black guys on the street corner, I said, "Hey, fellas, how are things in the community of color today?" They'd look at me and I was crazy. That's jive-ass shit, all right? If you want your language in the way that you communicate in your presentation is really critical when you're trying to convince people that your way of governing the country is better than the other way. But if you want to turn somebody off, use coded words that just elite educated people use, and that will confirm every suspicion that they have about you. And this party is run too much by the faculty lounge at Columbia and not enough by the people who are out there voting and living in it. That's my general view.
Leslie, take this up because you are credited, I don't know if everyone knows this, with bringing the Republican Party to Univision, to getting Republican candidates speaking Spanish. If we're talking to the communities, what does that look like? And I'd love your perspective on this, not just sort of from a Republican perspective, but also from a Latina perspective.
Sure. I love that question because it lets me talk about briefly AJC and my friends at AJC put together a coalition of women journalists early in our career, and we went to Israel. And those women have gone on to lead extraordinarily powerful lives in terms of influencing the Latino community. And I wanted to say it's one of the most important steps of my professional career was that trip to Israel. Not only because it really was. It was profound. The caliber of women that were put together and the way we were able to think about ideas, and most of them, we were split completely bipartisan, but we have formed a very strong bond, and we have defended each other aggressively because of the misconceptions on both sides by our parties of us. Because we don't fit. I always said Washington for us was like wearing a shoe that was too tight. Like they didn't know what we were. You're an Eskimo. Like nobody knew what Latinos were and Hispanics, and you're all Puerto Rican, and like it's a very mixed. We don't know. They don't know. I would hear that. I would hear that all the time. Oh, you're Hispanic. I got Puerto Ricans in my district. I'm like, okay, that's nice. I'm Mexican American. Cool. Because what both parties, I think, failed to do, and I had this conversation this week, is we fail to meet people where they are. And I think it's a less eloquent way of saying what James just said.
Along the amplifier said, one of my favorite Democrats is a congressman in Arizona named Ruben Gallego. Ruben was a Marine Corps veteran. He's in Congress, and he just went, he said, no one uses the term Latinx. No one even knows what you're talking about. They just know that you're trying to act smarter than them. And he's right. And by the way, he's going to run for the Senate against Kristen Sinema in 2024. He'll beat her by 35 points, if she can even run. But Ruben is somebody to really watch. I think he's a young guy in the party going forward. But he is part of what I refer to as the English-speaking wing of the Democratic Party, which if you actually have to say that, and when you say that, people know exactly what you're talking about. And one of our bigger problems is we send cultural odors out that people find odious. It's the nicest way I can say that these people are full of crap. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
On that lovely note.
That's nice.
You know, love that lead in. And as I'm going to mention a member of Congress's name, so let me give some time on the tape so it
Clear the air.
Somebody else I would follow in Texas, Tony Gonzalez, Texas 23. That's an area that of my former member of Congress that I worked for, Henry Bonilla, for years, and Will Hurt, and have been in that. It's a very critical area that is outside of San Antonio, Texas, and it includes all the way to El Paso, so about 700 miles of U.S.-Mexico border. It's an area that was traditionally Hispanic, like overwhelmingly in some of these communities in the Rio Grande Valley. That's what we're going to be hearing a lot about this election cycle, is this whole Rio Grande Valley area. New York Times is sending reporters down to South Texas to understand why on earth would Hispanic voters who were traditionally, they are registered Democrats, vote for these Republican candidates. And there's 3 seats down there that could flip for Latinas. They would be the first ever Hispanic women Republicans, or Hispanic women, let's just put it that way, elected to Congress from Texas. Regardless of the party, that's phenomenal. But all of this is stacking up, and it's moving to the right. And what we're learning down there is these are people who traditionally were not in politics. They used to consider themselves Democrats. Now they're running as Republicans, and they're overwhelmingly women because they don't get in. A lot of people just didn't think that there were races that Republicans could win. So a group of Hispanic women stepped up and said, you know what, I'll take the reins, I'll raise money. Texas 15, Monica De La Cruz, she came really close last election cycle. She looks really good, like she may win this election cycle. And the reason it is people say Trump won that area in South Texas, a very conservative, Latino, Democratic area by 20 points. What they don't talk about is in the rural areas, just outside some of those towns, he won by 32 points. So people are saying, well, how could that be? This is a Democratic territory. It's because they're not treating politics as usual. They're finding non-traditional candidates who are talking in language that they understand about issues they understand, and they're not being written in talking points by the Republican National Committee. And the party is confused of who they are, and that's why this
Are they the Republican squad?
They may become a very powerful part, and Tony Gonzalez handpicked. He's part of the young guns at the National Republican Congressional Committee that is like identifying people who can meet the $100,000 threshold. Can they raise money? You know, the same challenges non-traditional candidates have. But they're changing the system because there's an opportunity for them, and traditional way of talking to people on the right and the left isn't working.
Leslie, before you were talking about the extremist voices not really having an impact on policy, that they make a big noise, they command media attention, but they're not actually influencing the policy. And I said we'd come back to that. And I think now is a really good time because there are those Ruben Gallegos who are influencing policy, but I think sometimes we're too quick to dismiss. So in AJC, we follow support for Israel very closely, obviously. And when the squad first came into Congress, the common response by Democrats, James, was, yeah, they're loud, people are paying attention to them, but they don't have an impact. But last year, when there was a vote on funding for Israel's Iron Dome missile defense, it was a few members of, a very progressive wing of the Democratic Party who said, no, let's vote just on that. Let's not lump support for Israel in with other things we are funding. Let's just vote on whether or not Israel should have missile defense. And it passed, thank goodness, but that was sort of a landmark moment. And so, James, I want to ask you, is that talk? Are they influencing policy? Are they increasingly going to flex those muscles?
Well, first of all, the Iron Dome was put in by President Obama, who, as I recall, was a Democrat.
Give credit where credit's due.
There are two things, there's some things you can, yes, there is a anti-Israel sentiment on the extreme American left. All right, remember the person most responsible for the formation, the creation of the state of Israel was probably Harry Truman. All right, so, and there's also a distinction between being pro-Israel and being pro the government of Israel. All right, being pro-Israel does not necessitate that you have to agree with the government, because having worked in Israel, I can assure you that many people that live there that don't like the government, like a lot, and can be quite vocal about it. Thank you. But I do think that the Democrats have been with Israel very much since its founding, and continue to be so. Do we have some voices on our left that can sometimes get, I don't know, ahead of themselves or kind of silly? Yeah, but let me tell you something. There wasn't good people on both sides in Charlottesville. There really wasn't. There could be good people on one side, and there were really bad people on the other side. Really bad. So I think I would call this some background squabble in the Democratic Party. It's hardly more than 5 or 6 people in the caucus that feel this way. And I think they're more, it's more become kind of a left-wing chic thing. It's always been to be for the Palestinians and against the Israelis. It's just kind of the nature of that side. I actually like Palestinians fine. I know any number of them, and I consider myself to be very pro-Israel. I don't think one excludes the other necessarily.
On the Republican side, we often hear, and this is, I would say, sort of inside Washington, when people are speaking candidly, they'll say, we don't understand the Jewish community. We've done everything we can for Israel. President Trump did the Abraham Accords, monumental, all of this. What more do you people want? And there are facets of the Jewish community that fall in line and say, this is the way to go. And a lot who say, but what about Charlottesville? What about anti-Semitic things made by Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jews responsible for space lasers? What do you say about that in terms of the Jewish vote and the Jewish space within the Republican Party?
So there's 2 parts, I think, to that. One, if from a broader perspective, a global perspective, the geopolitical risk that Israel faces and the impact that it has on the globe is very significant, but that's a constant re-education, I think, especially for these new members, for individuals who don't have that experience. And I continue to encourage that, because there is a delta in terms of what people that fundamentally understand Israel, the concepts, the challenges, where it is in the world, and why the U.S. has to continue its support, and others that see it as a talking point because they don't have a connection to it. So there's that perspective, and James is talking about that. The other perspective is all the anti-Semitic, the rise in crime and hate crimes, the rise in violence that has been happening, and connecting that to a culture problem, and why it's everybody's problem. It's not just a cultural problem, but it's everyone's problem that we're seeing this rise in violence, and how it is imperative that we meet these communities where they are and have that relationship. I think there's many members who just don't have that relationship on both sides of the aisle for their own reasons.
Any time that someone refers to a group that they're not a member of as you people, that's not good, okay? That's a, I wouldn't say it's a slur, but it's really not good. To dig a little bit deeper here, I have always had, in working there, and I have a lot of friends, several are dual citizens. I've never much liked the idea of the settlements. I think they're provocative. I think they cause image problems. They cause real problems. Now, that's a legitimate concern that someone could have. All right? And therein lies the thing is you can disagree with the policies of the government of Israel and at the same time be pro-Israel. And sometimes people have to stop, digest that, and think about it. And it's, you know, a lot of these problems they're difficult. The state of Israel has always been under constant, not just attack, but under constant question, and that's the way it is, and it's probably going to stay that way for a while. But it's a pretty cool place, actually. I like going there.
A ringing endorsement from James Carville. We're going to go to audience questions in just one moment, but I made a promise at the start that we would also talk about the role of the parties, the party establishment themselves. And we've alluded to it, but I'll ask a more targeted question. When somebody goes off the rails, when a candidate or an elected official says something that veers towards the extreme, let's say, because we're a room largely of Jews, that it's anti-Semitic. What are the party establishments doing? What should they be doing?
Okay. Where there is no fear, a political party will perish. And I have been on this film, on the White House. If somebody goes on television and says something that is not helpful, they should pick up the phone and call them. All right? But we don't enforce. If somebody can tell me what the DNC does, I'd be glad. I'm open to any suggestion. All right? I really am. But we don't have any. Every Democrat is, I'm free, I can express my own opinion. Well, I can express my opinion too. And my opinion is I wish you would shut up because you're not doing anybody any good. But we don't, there's no real enforcement mechanism on the Democratic side. And so what it's caused is this. To think about this. President Biden, President Trump, at a comparable time, had about the same approval. It was pretty dismal. It was like 42, all right? But there's one big difference. President Trump's approval among Republicans was 95. President Biden's approval among Democrats is 75. Now, why is that so? Because you got people out there saying Biden hadn't done anything for you. And so if other Democrats are saying Biden hadn't done anything, well, I guess if they think he hadn't done anything, he probably hadn't done anything. And then independents say, well, I hear these Democrats on TV saying Biden hadn't done anything, so I guess he really hadn't done anything. And the reason that they do that is because they can get away with it. And I've talked to the White House, and I said, y'all have to put some, in the Clinton administration, if you went on television and you used the term stock market, Bob Rubin himself would call you and said, don't talk about the stock market, James. You don't know what that's going to do. You can talk about GDP growth. You can talk about job growth. You can talk about anything. So that's something you never heard because the Secretary of Treasury calls you and tells you don't say that. You're not going to say it. And if you, in the problem within the Democrats, in the administration, there is no fear of them. And if there's no fear, if I run a campaign and people are not afraid of me, I am a bad campaign manager. Now you have to have collaborative and committees to do everything, and you got to ask everybody how they're feeling, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, it used to be just go out and do this, goddammit, move it, go. That's the way a political, the purpose of a political party is to win elections. It really is. That's what you're there for. You're not there to push an agenda or anything else. You're there to win. And the way that you do it is by having power. And it sounds so unidealistic. It sounds so great to be a visionary and to bring about change and unity and togetherness and community and fraternity. And if you don't win, it don't do you any good. And just watch and see the month that you're getting ready to have. Leslie,
are the Republicans more organized or more fear-inspiring?
Oh, gosh. There's no fear. It's like the Wimp Party for many people. Yeah, I'll give you, there's no fear. What, are they going to sanction somebody? They're going to censor somebody if someone says anything radical and extreme. It's almost like a tap on the hand, and then the effort keeps going. And that's the part. And I want to kind of walk back where you said, and I want to clarify, do these extremists have an influence on policy? And I want to modify that. They do in the sense of whether they're opposition to it, the amount of time that has to be talked, kind of walking people off extreme examples of legislation that could never work, or why it really speaks to why you can't get compromise in the middle. Let's talk about reproductive rights. You're seeing a lot of governors move forward with restrictions on reproductive rights and restriction on abortion because they're getting tremendous, and people would say they're outliers, right? But they're getting tremendous support on the state. And then another governor, following James' point, goes, wow, that's really successful. Okay, let's go. I'm tapping into this populist movement, so let's do it in Texas. And you know what? There's like 14 other states that are now looking at increasing a lot of these restrictions because they're seeing, it's like that live wire. Like they touch it and they go, oh, there's no repercussions for going there. Let's go ahead and see how far we can go. And the voters of the state continue to support them fundamentally, and that's where we're starting to see that the impact is there. And with respect to the party, even Trump beat out, 21, 22 traditional establishment, we call it establishment, that followed the traditional role of Republicans to be the head of the party. And I remember Reince Priebus going into some of these meetings as they were saying that, and they said what James just said. They said, look, you don't have to like the guy, but the guy keeps winning. People get it because he has plain speak. Like he talks to them about the things that they are worried about in a way that doesn't sound like it's written, in a talking point at the RNC. And that really resonated. So he was the person who tapped into it, and now there are others, because a lot of Trump fatigue, but there are others who are tapping into that same line of thinking and feeling by these voters who are increasingly frustrated.
Thank you. Audience. There are mic runners. I see one.
You got 2 mic runners, so you get to pick.
Perfect. Okay, good. Maybe we can take 2 questions at a time. Is that okay?
Whatever you.
Okay.
We'll do 2 here and we'll do 2 there.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Sorry, I guess.
Thank you.
Questions, remember.
I remember. This is a question for both of you, but it's really about language. And I'm more interested in hearing ideas about how to use language. Here's what I mean. When Republicans use the term radical liberal agenda, why doesn't somebody object to that? And what I mean is my wife and I are liberal Democrats, but we went to the most conservative of business schools, University of Chicago. I was a Marine Corps officer, and I was an institutional money manager. I don't think we believe in a radical liberal agenda. Second thing is when people use the word conservative, I regard conservative as Mitt Romney, as Liz Cheney, as George Will. I don't regard Marjorie Taylor Greene as a conservative. She's a nutcase as far as I'm concerned. Final thing is, when Democrats use words that are key words, you can tell they're a Democrat, I want them to use something else. And what I mean is when I hear somebody say they're deeply troubled, I know they're a Democrat. When I hear somebody say something is problematic, I know they're a Democrat. Why can't, instead of deeply troubled, saying I'm pissed off? Why can't you say, instead of problematic, it's a big effing problem? Talking the way normal people talk.
You must be me.
Wait, we'll get one more, we'll get one more.
Julie? Thank you. My question is to Mr. Carville. You said that Israel, people can love the country and not love the government. Quite frankly, that's true for any country in the world. I want to drill down a little bit more, because we have a BDS movement in this country that is getting increasingly strident and is calling for the elimination of Israel. And that's primarily in the Democratic Party on the left and the so-called progressive part of the Democratic Party, and on campuses. And that is a very dangerous direction that is purely anti-Semitic. So would you please comment on that?
How many in the Democratic House voted against this? Just the number.
Against
Huh?
Iron Dome, you mean?
Yeah, I'll get to, but how many in the Democratic caucus would you say are decidedly anti-Israel? What percent?
Okay.
Okay, my point is, it is
We could do a poll.
small.
Who generally vote Democratic.
Right. I understand your question. I concede that there is a small, and I emphasize the word small, part of the Democratic Party that is anti the state of Israel. But it is very small. And to go to the first question, thank you, sir. You make my point exactly. If you're talking to people, you have to talk in their language that they can understand. You cannot talk in coastal code. And so I appreciate it. And you're right, there is a part, I would use to qualify, a very small part. And by the way, most of these people consider themselves democratic socialists, not Democrats. That's another thing to remember. They would tell you that they're very much anti-establishment Democrats like James Carville, because when you see me, you say, man, that's an establishment guy right there if I ever saw one, right? And so your point is well taken. I would just amplify that it is a very small part. And many of these people do not identify as Democrats.
Leslie, do you have anything you want to add about the language?
Language is key. I thought the point here about understanding, it's funny, I was just working on a survey and it was talking to Hispanic voters, and in many cases it's using some of the same old language that doesn't even make any sense. And I'm like, people don't even speak that way. And it takes...
Can you give us an example?
There was some you as a great example. So they said, well, you and your Latino community think that whatever. And I'm like, this is a survey. Like, you want to say, like, are they doing something for the Hispanic community? How do you feel your family is responding? You wouldn't say you, because it's like isolated, like you people. It was like you as that individual. How do you think that they're doing over there? It's like, you know, you as a Jewish individual, how do you feel that they're doing with the Jewish thing? It's one thing to ask, like, say, I already know I'm speaking to Hispanic people. If I'm already at an organization, I would say, do you feel that they are reflective? You don't isolate based on label or identity. You talk to them as a person. And a lot of the structure of surveys on both sides, I think it's this incestuous problem. It just keeps repeating itself because the methodology of how we, and it just how we talk to people has not changed for a long time. I remember a press secretary on the Republican side for a House member said, how do you know, because I used to come in and say, this is how people hear when we're talking about the war, or how we hear, this is how voters are hearing this when you say that. And they go, she came out to me, and she was wonderful young, press secretary on the Hill, and she goes, how do you know how to write for women? And I'm like, how do you not? Just talk, because she had been trained to write press releases in a certain way. This is how we do it in Washington. And I don't think anybody even understands that anymore.
Very good point.
Great program. Hey, Julie, it's Arnie over here.
Oh, hello.
Hey. Thank you both. Tremendous program, Julie. Great job. So I was with a prominent Republican congressperson 2 weeks ago, who's one of the most decorated prosecutors in American history. And he was one of the few to endorse the impeachment of Donald Trump. He had dealt with some very threatening cases over his career. He had to have 24/7 security. His career is over. So when you say that the Republican Party is the party of wimps and not the party of fear, that was not my experience speaking with this man. And so the question was, what does it happen when a candidate goes off the rails? What happens when a candidate stays on the rails, but the party has gone off the rails?
I love that question.
Hi, Shrub Kempner from Galveston. You guys know where that is. There's a report on Bloomberg this morning that indicates that 100 different Republican candidates have won primaries who do not believe that Joe Biden won the election. And so my question to both of you is, how do you react to that in terms of the way you are seeing things? These are at all levels, but not totally local. And in some of them, all of them basically important policy levels. And that's now. There may be more, of course, later on through the primary season. So I'd like to get both of your reactions, but particularly you, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm from Houston, Corpus Christi, so I understand.
I understand.
I understand how you're saying. I'm a military brat, and I'm a military family, and my spouse is active duty military right now. So, and as a Republican, I'm not going to say, we don't fundamentally understand the sacrifices that go in this country. When people say that they cannot understand the democracy of which they defend every day, they don't exercise it, they defend, our armed services defend that democracy. It is a fissure in our democracy. I think it's important that Republican and Democrat come back and we put an end to the big lie, because that is doing nothing but destroying this country. When I say the issue of wimp, I'm going to speak to a specific race and a specific a group of voters we heard about in Texas for George P. Bush. So the Bush legacy, right? The Bush legacy of HWWP, who was eventually, our hopes in Texas is George P. Bush, being the son of Jeb Bush, was he was running for Attorney General, and he lost significantly because people felt that brand of republicanism, of diplomacy and bringing people together and the establishment type was tired and done, and they called that type of approach weak and wimpy. That's where the word came from, weak and wimpy in Texas. It was not, they wanted the confrontation of these extreme positions, and they wanted a fighter, somebody to fight on that. I think you can be somebody who's an advocate and strong and stand and fight for your principles without sacrificing the tenets of this democracy which we hold dear. And I think the answer is somewhere in the middle.
Okay, thank you. So let's go to the first question. Trump is a career criminal. And most Republicans want him protected. That's a fact, and if you don't, your chances of losing a primary are really, really high. This is my analysis of the current Republican Party. I go back to Lester Maddox, who was a segregationist, but he was governor of Georgia, and he once observed that the problem with the Georgia prisons is the quality of the inmate. All right. Honestly, the problem with the Republican Party is the quality of people who vote in their primaries. All right. And the people that don't believe that Biden won the election are the same people that think the earth is 5,000 years old, are the same people that think that climate is a Chinese hoax. All right. I mean, there's nothing, and by the way, it's not, unlike the people we're talking about earlier, the small part of the Democratic Party that is, most of them are not Democrats, but the small number of people on the left who are anti-Israel nowhere match the number of people who vote Republican that believe in this nonsense. And when somebody says something, Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, your friend that was talking to you, it's the same thing. We're talking about a sliver of people in one party, and we're talking about a literal majority of the people in another party. And that's my overall message to you. It's not on one hand, the other hand. It's on one hand and the other pinky finger. All right? It's not a comparable thing. Understand that. You're talking about a majority in many states of the Republican Party. I mean, I have no idea how having an AR-15 became doctrine in an American political party, because you're in the Marine Corps and no one needs one of these things to do anything other than shoot other people. In 1994, Bill Clinton and Joe Biden passed the crime bill. In that crime bill was a ban on assault weapons. Yet you couldn't buy one. That was repealed by George Bush and the Republicans in 2004. Now, in 1994, there were 400,000 assault weapons in the United States. Today, there are 20 million. You want to talk about what government policy can do, what politics can do? How many people, school children, would be alive today if that ban would have stayed in place? And by the way, I remember 1999. I remember 2002. You know what people were doing? They were hunting. They went to gun clubs. They took marksmanship practice. All right? This wasn't a place where people, but you couldn't buy an assault weapon, of which you don't need. And until we understand how politics drives policy and policy drives life, we're not going to really understand what this is about. This is very, very, very important stuff that we're talking about. And I have trouble getting that across to people sometimes, but just think about how life would be today. And if we had an assault weapons ban that had been in place since 1994, you wouldn't even know it. Even your sportsman friends wouldn't even know it. If I had Marine Corps marksmanship training and I couldn't hit a deer without an automatic weapon, then I don't deserve to have anything. I mean, that's just ludicrous.
I think we have time for one more round. Yes.
So I wanted to follow up on your last observation. If the polls are correct that a majority of Americans in both political parties across the spectrum favor more rigorous gun control, why is it so impossible to get it passed? Why is it, if a majority of voters are not influencing the Republicans in Congress so that more effective gun regulation is not enacted, and that's been going on for 2 decades?
All right, one more.
Yeah, Mr. Carville, I need to push back a little bit on some of the things that you were saying. In 2012, and caveat, I'm a Republican, we have extremists on our side, they're execrable, they should be removed from the party. But when you're talking about only a sliver of the Democrats having extreme ideas, I don't really think that's borne out by facts. In 2012, in the convention in Charlotte, when there was a voice vote to try to confirm Jerusalem as the eternal and unified capital of the Jewish people in Israel, it was shouted three or four times by the base of the voters there. That's your base. When you have people now who are putting out maps, like in Massachusetts, pointing out where every Jewish enterprise is and every Jewish institution so they can be pushed against, that's your base. Republicans aren't doing that. And we have problems enough on our end, but to just say, well, this is a few extreme radicals, those radicals are a significant part of your party. They need to be addressed with. We need to see the establishment figures in your party standing up and pushing back against this. But there's fear on the Republican side, there's fear on the Democratic side too against doing this. And it needs to end, or this is going to get worse and worse and worse. Thank you.
Were any of these people passing this out elected Democrats? I have no, paying out anybody's address is offensive, but let me cut to the chase here. So somebody actually asked, the Pew poll, which is a very well done poll, it's very recognized, a well done poll, broke America into 9 different political groups. One were independents. That was one part of the country. Then they scaled the Republican Party into 4 different groups. And they scaled the Democratic Party into 4 different groups. Do you know what was the smallest group of the 9? People that described themselves as progressive liberals. It was 11% of the Democratic Party and 6% of the country. By the way, of the 4 groups within the Democratic Party, that was the only majority white group. Most of the Democratic Party are racial minorities, particularly blacks, a lot of suburban women, famously, and well-known. Some people still, like in the labor movement now. These are not, by and large, as James Clyburn said, the most conservative man I ever knew in my life was my daddy. And so the people that vote, that is 11% of our party. They make 65% of the noise. Now, to your question, we're talking about, people agree with us. They want background checks. They don't want assault weapons. They agree with us on the abortion issue. They agree with us on climate. They agree with us on a lot of issues. What they don't do is vote for us. And I'm tired of winning arguments. I want to start winning elections, because winning the argument doesn't do you very much good. We win the argument. People agree. But our people don't vote. And their people come out. And if you're a young person in America today and you're watching what's going on and you're not motivated, I don't know if there's a lot that I can say that's going to motivate you. I mean, look at the utter contempt of the way that they treated this Justice Brown when she was being before that congressional committee. How could any woman or any black person, anybody see exactly what was going on there? And it was right in front of you. How can anybody see what's happening right now around the world with this climate and not think that this is something that we got to address and address it pronto? How can anybody look at what's going on with these guns and say, hey, this is something and we need to do something about this a long time ago? Yet, all of these issues, the public is with us and they don't vote for us. And that's because we become abstract and arrogant and snobbish. And that's not the way that you win elections. It's not the way that you do it. You know, my favorite politician of all time, of course, is Bill Clinton. You ever seen Bill Clinton say a snobbish or arrogant thing? No. No. And you never will. And therein lies a lot of our problem. But again, it's a very small part of our party. It's an even smaller part of America.
I want to say on the Republican and the Democratic side, and I was thinking about your point about the 2012, certainly 2020. There were a lot of voices at the Democratic convention that a lot of the delegates and many in the party were supporting extreme positions that didn't sound like the traditional Democratic platform. Everything you were saying makes sense, except for Biden has accepted a lot of these things when you're talking about eliminating student debt. Some of these extreme positions now are becoming part of the platform with the
Wait a minute, he's not talking
fuels.
talking about eliminating student debt. He's talking about $10,000 in debt relief, which I kind of agree with, but don't say he's talking about eliminating student debt because he's doing no such thing.
A lot of people would say that's the slippery slope, James. That's the part. He was never talking about those efforts. He was never talking about any of these things until he was being pushed on the left that they feel is this new woke culture, that what everyone wants. And it's moving its way into what the president said.
If Biden wouldn't know what woke was, you couldn't explain it to him. What are you talking about, pal? All right? And some of this, you know, and again, I'm done talking about $10,000 in student debt. Oh, well, if you do that, you know, but we were told that Medicare was a slippery slope. Ronald Reagan said, that's it, you got socialized medicine. Who wants to get rid of Medicare now? No one. Who wants to get rid of Social Security? No one. All right? It's just not, and Biden, there's a lot of things, you can criticize him or whatever, woke, not one of them, because you couldn't explain to him what it means. All right? And so I just, the amount of people in my party that are extreme are small and they're kind of goofy. The number of people in that party that extreme are significantly larger, and they're not goofy, they're evil. There's a difference between the two. It shouldn't be confused.
Leslie.
I think the thing we have to be mindful of is there's an increasing number of candidates and certainly incumbents that understand and reflect the voters that they represent. And a lot of these ideas people say, and I keep going back to this populist thing, the reason establishment Republican is out of touch and they keep losing these elections is because they want to see more done in ways that affect working families. And that's the shift with where Republicans have come into light, into their own, is now it is looking increasingly more like a working class, fundamentally higher income to some extent, but very critical of the government type of voter that is now more aligned with Republicans than they were Democrats. You used to say these were, you know, the Ohio River Valley, these were the traditional conservative Democrats that don't really exist anymore. They have found a way. They are increasingly Latino. They would have been a conservative Democrat. They don't feel that they recognize the party at all. And that's where the opportunity is for Republicans, and that's what you're starting to see Republicans responding to. So they're culturally conservative, economically conservative, and they don't trust, nor do they have faith in the old guard of Republican Party. They want to see something new.
I'm sorry. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative because I think that's a really critical point. And I've been saying for a while that at some point, these polls are going to become too polarized and that centrism will be the new sexy. Tell me, am I right? As we leave this auditorium, can we do so with a little bit of hope?
I think there's a lot of hope in these new candidates that are winning, particularly women and women of color, because historically they are the ones that come to the table and can bridge the gap between the two. They're not considered traditional candidates. They're outliers in some sense, and they want to get things done. And they've been successful the way they see it. They've organized their crazy families. They can come to Washington and organize, you know, whatever they got to do there. So I have faith.
James, is it a
Well, first of all, I just want to thank, it's the second time I've done an event in this building, and this is one of the most significant religious buildings in the entire United States. So it's a big honor to be here. It's a big honor to be on stage with these two very talented people and to entertain questions from this audience. I mean that. I think what's going to happen in 2024, I think there are going to be 4 people that are not going to be running on a ticket, and they're going to be Trump, Pence, Biden, and Harris. I think that there's going to be a convulsion. I don't know this, but I think there's just going to break. And there's just becoming an increasingly sense that people have that things are not working the way they're supposed to work. And when that happens, you usually have it. And I can't guarantee you that don't take it to mean that whatever you get is not going to be worse than Trump. I don't know that. I think that the president has some good programs. I like him, but I just can feel that there's a generational shift, and I'll be 78 this year, so I'll be out with the bathwater myself. But I feel like there's a shift, and Jamie Dimon once famously said, "No one ever went broke betting on America," and it's still a damn good bet. I really believe that. But I really thank my colleagues on the panel, and I thank the AJC for inviting us, and I thank this temple for hosting us.
And we thank our panelists. We knew that this would be interesting. But I think it's been much more than that. And in some ways, it's been instructive. Because as you could tell from the audience questions, a lot of folks within the AJC family have, I don't mean to sound coastal, deep concerns on both the left and the right. And what you've both done is illuminate to us very clearly where the challenges are and where the opportunities are. So we thank you, we appreciate your friendship, and as we move forward throughout the day, I think we'll be thinking about a lot of the things that we heard here this morning.
Thank you all.